How stupid were we to do that? But we did it. But we gave it back. But how ungrateful are they now?
This is not who we are. This is not how you maintain the most important and profound and successful military alliance in the history of this planet. It's disrespectful, it's unproductive, and it's unsustainable. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they've got to be cheering from the bleachers.
Davos went quiet. Not polite, quiet, not listening quietly. The kind of calm that drops after a leader speaks, and every allied delegation in the room feels the ground shift under the alliance. Picture it, a global stage, the US president just finished, and instead of energy, you get stillness. Hands down, eyes forward, the air full of silent math. The consequence arrives, firster, saint, and it is brutal in its simplicity. The United States is being priced as a variable, not the anchor, the variable. When America becomes the variable, everyone hedges, everyone builds redundancy, and everyone plans for the day the guarantee is not guaranteed. Immediate shock and stakes, Republican Senator Thom Tillis was sitting with the U.S. delegation, and he did not describe applause. He described a lot of silence. He called the moment an opportunity missed. Then he delivered the line that matters to anyone who understands power. Allies and partners are starting to think that they have to diversify away and de-risk from the United States of America. De-risk, diversify. Those are not friendship words. Those are portfolio words. That is what you say when an exposure starts to look dangerous. That is what you do when you stop assuming stability and start planning for turbulence. Tillis is not pretending there is no legitimate grievance. He acknowledges the president's goal of pushing NATO members up to their commitments, and he says Trump did that better than any president since the alliance was forged. He even credits the achievement, but he is also telling you what the room felt. The posture is now so abrasive that allies start planning for worst-case scenarios about the current U.S. stance. That is how alliances rot. Not with one dramatic exit, but with 1,000 small adjustments. Cooperation becomes conditional, planning becomes defensive, budgets shift, supply chains realign, intelligence sharing narrows, and the democratic world, as Tillis puts it, loses something essential when it is not working together. Now add the detonator, NATO rhetoric that treats the alliance like an enemy. The president reposts the idea that NATO is the enemy within, and then casts doubt that allies would honor Article 5 for one another. Tillis does not let that slide, because the audience already knows the cold fact. The only time Article 5 was ever invoked was after 9/11, in defense of the United States. Partners came when America was attacked. They bled with us. They paid with their lives. So when that history meets public disrespect, it tells allies their sacrifice is being discounted and their loyalty is being questioned at the same time. Now bring Greenland into focus, because this is where the theater turns into a measurable diplomatic wound. The president talks about Greenland, talks about imposing huge tariffs on NATO allies who oppose his attempt to take it, and then says he won't use force to take over Greenland. Tillis calls that a false concession because Congress would not sit still for force. He says there would likely be enough votes for a war powers resolution that would be veto-proof. Translation: even inside the delegation, they know the threat is not legally usable, but the damage is still diplomatically real. Tillis goes further. He says the United States already has unfettered access, backed by an agreement dating to 1951, and Denmark and Greenland have offered to expand that access without America spending billions to take territory. Greenland needs infrastructure investment, not a conquest. He notes a base in an attractive region where ports do not freeze was once offered for $1. That is the gap. Right now, trust, reset, be precise about the messenger. Tillis is not an opposition activist. He is a Republican fiscal conservative, warning that this approach is disrespectful, unproductive, and unsustainable. And when a senator like that says the room went silent, he is telling you the world just heard a superpower gamble with alliance credibility. The president can posture, but he cannot rewrite the Constitution with a microphone. Tillis makes that plain when he calls the won't use force line a false concession. Why? Because the legal barrier is not the president's restraint. It is the system's refusal. Congress holds war powers. Congress controls funding. Congress can force a vote that boxes in a White House that wants to look strong without paying the price of legality. That is the first legal pressure point. The threat collapses into procedure, and the second lawmakers decide to treat it as real. Then comes the second pressure point. Treaties and commitments are not vibes. Article 5 is not a slogan you turn on and off depending on a news cycle. Tillis keeps repeating it because it is the spine of the entire alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. When an American president suggests allies would not honor it, and he treats that suspicion as justification for disrespect, he is not merely insulting them, he is undermining a binding architecture that underwrites deterrence. Deterrence is not about what you do in private. It is about what the other side believes you will do in public when it counts. When the signal becomes uncertain, the deterrent weakens. When the deterrent weakens, the price of security rises everywhere. Now add the Greenland facts Tillis lays out because they matter legally and financially at once. The United States already has presence options in Greenland today without having to spend $1, as he puts it. There is an agreement dating back to 1951 that already provides access, and Denmark and Greenland have indicated they would expand and make it more accommodating. In other words, the lawful path exists and the strategic path exists. The administration's contemplated posture, in Tillis's view, chooses conflict even when cooperation delivers the same access faster and cheaper. That is not hard power. That is sloppy power. And that is where the fiscal conservative argument turns into a weapon against the bravado. Greenland, Tillis says, needs massive investment in infrastructure just to support the basics. It is a territory with enormous logistical demands. If the United States tried to take it, the bill would arrive in perpetuity. Ports, airfields, roads, housing, supply chains, security, governance. Meanwhile, Tillis points out an almost mocking detail. Greenland once offered to sell a military base in an attractive region where the ports do not freeze in winter for $1. For $1. That is not a negotiation problem. That is a strategy problem. And tariffs are not harmless bluff in a room like Davos. Tariffs are immediate price signals. They hit contracts, supply chains, and voting blocs, and they do it faster than diplomacy can repair the damage. When you threaten tariffs on allies to force a territorial outcome, you are not bargaining in a vacuum. You are punishing your own manufacturers, your own consumers, and your own credibility at the same time. That is why Tillis's fiscal argument lands. Project Arctic power by building a multinational NATO presence, share the burden, lock in access through existing agreements, and stop acting like conquest is cheaper than cooperation. Because the cheap option is legal clarity. So what is actually being litigated here? Not territory, not security, credibility, credibility with allies, credibility with Congress, credibility with the public, credibility with adversaries who watch how America treats its friends to predict how it will treat its commitments. Tillis is asking the simplest legal question, most politically. Why spend billions to seize what you can secure through existing agreements? Trust reset, tightened. This is why his emotion lands when he talks about Denmark. He is not romanticizing Europe. He is reminding Washington that alliances have receipts. Denmark honored Article 5. Denmark went to Afghanistan with the United States. Denmark lost lives. When America talks about ungrateful, those families hear it as a revision of the record. In law, the record matters. In politics, the record matters. In alliances, the record is everything. This is where the pressure multiplies because the story leaves the stage and hits the institutions. Tillis tells you he expects Congress to move if force is even hinted at, and he's not describing a symbolic gesture. A war powers resolution is a recorded vote, a legal line in the sand, a public rebuke that allies will read as evidence that America's system is restraining its own executive. That is the courtroom element in American politics. Separation of powers is the bench, the record, the transcript, and the verdict. It is not glamorous. It is not viral. It is the system doing what it was designed to do when rhetoric tries to outrun legality. But the escalation does not stop in Washington. It hits Europe in real time. European leaders are not confused about tariff threats. They are offended by the premise. They hear an attempt to punish them economically, unless they accept a U.S. territorial ambition. That is why you get the blunt language from Belgium's prime minister. Europe tried to appease, tried to be lenient, and now so many red lines are being crossed that the choice becomes self-respect versus servitude. That is not a diplomat's sentence. That is a warning flare. Now widen the frame to Denmark because Tillis makes it personal in a way that weaponizes the moral ledger. The interviewer notes Denmark's sacrifices in Afghanistan, and Tillis says he became emotional at a memorial in Copenhagen thinking about the families and loved ones of those soldiers. He describes Denmark's per capita loss as nearly matching that of the United States. In other words, a small country paid a high price for American security after America invoked the alliance. That is the alliance at its most real, and it comes with receipts. Then the president adds gasoline. He says the United States gave Greenland back to Denmark after World War II and calls that stupid, then asks how ungrateful they are now. Tillis does not answer with a policy memo. He answers with names on a wall. He goes back to the fallen, wonders what mothers and fathers are thinking, and says flatly, they were grateful. That sentence is the escalation, because it is a senator telling the world that the president's framing is not just strategically clumsy, it is morally corrosive. Tillis tries to split the difference, and you can hear the strain. Ukraine. He says relationships can be repaired, and he hopes the president takes advice, especially from people with stars on their shoulders who understand how profound the alliance is. He reminds the audience that the United States learns less and becomes less exquisite operationally when it is not testing itself among allies. That is capability. Interoperability is not a slogan. It is the product of repeated shared work, repeated shared standards, and repeated trust. Then he turns the knife back toward Europe because he is not letting them hide behind American dysfunction. He calls it a little bit rich to stand in the home of NATO and still not meet the 2% requirement. He points to what he describes as a combined $2 trillion shortfall in the first 2 decades of this century. He argues that if NATO had spent that money, the alliance would have had a stronger industrial base, stronger capabilities, and maybe even no incursion into Ukraine. Tillis then says to his Belgian colleagues, pay up. Get the legitimate argument off the table that has infuriated this president, and in Tillis's view, rightfully so. Because once Europe meets its obligations, Washington loses the excuse to treat allies as dead weight and starts facing the real question, why sabotage the alliance when the alliance is finally responding? And that is the escalation cycle. Legal pressure from Congress, diplomatic pressure from Europe is drawing red lines, moral pressure from memorial walls, and Afghanistan receipts. Financial pressure from tariff threats that ricochet through supply chains the moment they are spoken. Political pressure from a president performing strongly, while senators describe the result as silence, concern, and strategic disadvantage. Watch the alliance argue and watch adversaries take notes carefully. Davos is built for image. It is the annual theater of confidence, the selfie of global capitalism, the stage where leaders sell stability and executives sell inevitability. That is why Tillis's description of silence matters, the image cracked in real time. In that room, the president's words were not received as swagger, they were received as volatility. Davos does not reward volatility. Davos reprices it. The second a superpower sounds unpredictable, the cost shows up as hedging, higher risk premiums, and contingency planning. And here is the collapse. You cannot sell America is booming while simultaneously selling America must threaten its closest partners to be respected. Those two performances collide. When you threaten tariffs against NATO allies over Greenland, you are not only pressuring governments, you are pressuring balance sheets. You are telling manufacturers to plan for retaliation. You are telling investors to plan for friction. You are telling military planners to plan for a smaller coalition. The room that went silent is the room that writes the underwriting assumptions for the next year. Tillis drives the collapse with a pivot that lands like a verdict. After the president touts the booming U.S. economy, rising incomes, inflation defeated, Tillis says there is a disconnect. He says it is not productive to pretend there is no affordability crisis, especially when the denial comes from people who have never wanted for anything in their lives. Then he strips the Davos stage down to the floorboards. He says, take people back to the trailer park I grew up in and ask if they feel good today, and listen to the answer. That trailer park line matters because it exposes how image works. Image is expensive. Image is curated. An image is what you say in rooms where nobody is missing a meal. Reality is what people live with when rent goes up, when groceries hurt, when wages lag, when a booming graph does not buy a stable life. When leaders insist the crisis is over while people feel it daily, trust does not erode slowly. It breaks suddenly. And once trust breaks at home, foreign policy posturing stops looking strong and starts looking like a distraction. Now connect that domestic collapse to the Allied collapse, because Tillis does it for you. Denmark honored Article 5. Denmark went to Afghanistan after America was attacked. Denmark lost lives. Tillis says he became emotional at a memorial in Copenhagen thinking about the families and loved ones of those soldiers. Then the president talks about giving Greenland back after World War II and calls it stupid and calls Denmark ungrateful. That is the image versus reality collapse in one sentence. The image is dominante. The reality is debt. Debt of gratitude, debt of history, debt of credibility. Options break down. And now the choices are all bad. Double down and the tariff threat becomes real money, real retaliation, and real inflation pressure that comes back home to that trailer park. Retreat and you admit the posture was a bluff, handing opponents a weakness narrative and telling allies you were willing to risk them for a headline. Pivot to competence, multinational NATO presence in the Arctic, expanded access through existing agreements, investment instead of annexation, and you still anger the crowd that wanted conquest, not policy. Split the difference with half measures, and you satisfy nobody while the alliance keeps de-risking anyway. And notice the trap. Every path runs through law and money. Congress can bind a president. Markets can punish a bluff. Allies can say no. If you escalate, you pay. If you retreat, you bleed. If you compromise, you anger both camps. That is why Davos stayed quiet. The options are not heroic. They are costly. So the image has already collapsed. The only question left is how much damage gets priced in before institutions force a correction. The core fight here is not a map. It is whether the United States still treats power as something disciplined by law or as something justified by appetite. Senator Thom Tillis, speaking from Davos, is warning that the rule of law framework phrase when leaders talk about taking territory, punishing allies with tariffs for resisting, and questioning the very commitments that keep deterrence credible. Article 5 is not a slogan. It is a promise with consequences. It is the mechanism by which democracies agree that aggression will be met together, not alone. And the record matters. The only time Article 5 was invoked was after 9/11 in defense of the United States. That is not mythology, that is history. So when an American president suggests NATO partners are unreliable while simultaneously demanding respect, the moral ledger flips. It is no longer America protects you, it becomes America doubts you, and then asks you to accept tariffs and threats as proof of leadership. That is not leadership, that is coercion wearing a flag. And coercion is always expensive because it forces resistance, retaliation, and distrust. In that frame, Denmark is not a bargaining chip. Denmark is a witness. Denmark is evidence. Denmark is a receipt. Tillis says he stood at a memorial wall in Copenhagen and thought about what those families were hearing. He became emotional thinking about mothers, fathers, spouses, siblings, and what it feels like to watch their sacrifice discounted on television. The president says America gave Greenland back after World War II and calls that stupid, then asks how ungrateful Denmark is now. Tillis's reply is not complicated. Gratitude was proven in blood, and disrespect is not how you keep the free world together. Political and institutional fallout. This is where consequences spread beyond one president and one speech. Congress is watching. The Pentagon is watching. Allies are watching. Markets are watching. Every tariff threat is a price signal. It moves contracts, it moves supply chains, and it shows up later as cost pressure for the same families Tillis invoked. Every wobble in treaty language is a security signal. It pushes allies to build alternatives. That is the de-risking Tillis warned about, and it starts with planning and ends with separation. Tillis also reaches for the quiet power inside the system, people with stars on their shoulders. He is saying the military professionals understand the alliance is not charity, it is a capability. It is shared standards, shared training, shared logistics, shared intelligence, shared deterrence. He also turns the mirror toward Europe. Pay up, meet the 2% commitment, remove the legitimate grievance, stop handing American politicians an excuse to grandstand, because once Europe meets its obligations and Washington still chooses disrespect, Washington loses the excuse to treat allies like dead weight. Inevitable ending. Now watch the last door close. If Washington stays volatile, the alliance adapts around Washington. It builds redundancy. It builds European capacity. It coordinates without permission when it has to. Congress asserts limits when an executive flirts with force. Courts get dragged into boundary fights. Markets punish expensive drama. And adversaries probe the seams because they always do. Tillis calls this posture unsustainable, and he is right. Unsustainable is a timeline. Something gives because systems correct what egos distort. Either the system forces a reset back toward alliance, discipline, and mutual respect, or the rhetoric hardens into actions that trigger legal rebuke and political backlash. Either way, the bluff phase ends, and that is the point of the silence in Davos. It was not confusion, it was calculation. The world was measuring whether America would choose partnership or impulse. Measurements become policies, policies become realities, right in front. Either way, the bluff phase ends, and this is where Belgium's warning becomes the final caption: self-respect or servitude, a happy vessel or a miserable slave. The free world will choose self-respect because the rule of law requires it, and because history punishes alliances that treat loyalty as a commodity.